The people we walk past today may be the very ones who once carried us through our darkest hour, and forgetting that truth is the most expensive poverty of all. Snow drifted gently across Manhattan like tiny fragments of forgotten prayers, softening the sharp edges of steel towers that pierced the gray December sky. The city awakened with its familiar rhythm of honking taxis, hurried footsteps, and glowing storefronts wrapped in holiday lights, each corner promising warmth for those fortunate enough to afford it. Inside the back seat of a midnight black luxury sedan, Ethan Ashford barely noticed any of it. At 38, the billionaire founder of Ashford Global had become a man the financial world admired but rarely understood. Magazine covers celebrated his billion-dollar acquisitions. Business channels praised his relentless discipline. Investors trusted his judgment without hesitation. Yet none of those achievements could silence the quiet emptiness that had settled inside him over the past decade, a place no success had ever managed to reach. His driver eased the car toward a red light near a neighborhood Ethan had not visited in years, one that stood only a few blocks away from the glittering skyline but felt like an entirely different world. Through the tinted window, he noticed volunteers arranging folding tables beneath a modest church awning, handing out steaming bowls of soup, sandwiches wrapped in white paper, and cups of hot coffee to a growing line of people whose winter coats had long since surrendered to the cold. Some smiled politely despite their circumstances. Others stared silently at the pavement, carrying burdens too heavy for conversation. Ethan watched absent-mindedly until one familiar movement froze every thought inside his mind. Near the end of the line stood a young black woman wearing an oversized charcoal coat whose sleeves covered most of her hands. Her posture remained remarkably graceful despite the exhaustion written across her face. She accepted a small paper bag from a volunteer with both hands, offering a quiet smile of gratitude before stepping aside so the next person could receive theirs. It was not her face that captured him first. It was the simple woven leather bracelet resting loosely around her wrist. Time stopped. Ethan leaned closer to the glass, his heartbeat suddenly louder than the traffic outside. That bracelet should not exist. He knew every worn thread woven into its faded brown leather because years ago, with trembling hands and overwhelming gratitude, he had purchased it from a roadside artisan during a business trip through rural Tennessee. He had given it to a stranger whose name he never learned, a young woman who had refused every reward after pulling him from the wreckage of a burning vehicle on a rain-soaked highway late one autumn evening. By the time emergency responders arrived, she had quietly disappeared into the storm, leaving behind nothing except the memory of calm brown eyes, gentle courage, and a single sentence he had never forgotten. Make your second chance mean something. For 10 years, Ethan had searched whenever work allowed, hiring investigators, following impossible leads, hoping only to thank the woman who had given him the future he now lived. Every search ended the same way, with unanswered questions and another year of regret. Yet now, impossibly, she stood less than 30 feet away, waiting in line for donated food, while the city celebrated holiday abundance around her. Ethan felt something inside him crack, not from pity, but from the unbearable weight of recognition. Wealth had taught him how to build companies, negotiate impossible deals, and predict markets with astonishing precision. It had never taught him how someone capable of such extraordinary kindness could disappear into a life where survival depended upon the generosity of strangers. The traffic light turned green. Cars surged forward. His driver glanced into the rearview mirror, waiting for instructions. Ethan never took his eyes off the woman holding that small paper bag with quiet dignity. In a voice almost too soft to hear, he spoke words that would alter both of their lives forever. Pull over. Ethan stepped out of the car before his driver could reach the door, the icy wind brushing against the collar of his wool overcoat as he crossed the sidewalk with slow, deliberate steps. The bustling city seemed to fade behind him, replaced by the quiet murmur of grateful voices and the gentle clatter of volunteers refilling coffee urns. He stopped several feet away, watching the woman carefully as she tucked the small paper bag beneath her arm and thanked an elderly volunteer with a warmth that somehow made her appear wealthier than anyone standing on Fifth Avenue. There was no bitterness in her expression, no trace of resentment toward the world that had clearly asked too much of her. She simply smiled, wished the volunteer a Merry Christmas, and turned toward the narrow street lined with aging brick buildings. Ethan followed at a respectful distance, uncertain whether he wanted answers or simply proof that his memory had not betrayed him. As she reached a small public park, she sat quietly on a weathered wooden bench beneath a leafless maple tree. Instead of opening the food for herself, she noticed an elderly veteran wrapped in a faded army blanket sitting alone nearby. Without hesitation, she stood, walked over, and gently placed half of her meal into his hands. The older man looked up in surprise. She simply smiled again, wished him a peaceful day, and returned to her bench carrying only a single sandwich and a paper cup of coffee. Ethan felt his throat tighten. 10 years had passed, yet nothing essential about her had changed. She still gave first and thought of herself second. The sight carried him back to that rainy October afternoon he had spent years trying to forget. He had been 28, obsessed with expanding Ashford Global into a national company before his 30th birthday. Every meeting had felt urgent. Every minute had been scheduled. Driving alone through the winding highways outside Nashville after visiting a manufacturing site, he had ignored the growing storm, convinced another hour on the road mattered more than common sense. Then the rain became a wall of silver. Visibility disappeared. His tires slipped across soaked pavement, and within seconds the world dissolved into shattered glass, twisted metal, and complete silence. He remembered opening his eyes to the smell of wet earth and hearing a calm voice repeating that everything would be all right. Through blurred vision he had seen a young black woman kneeling beside him, rain soaking her denim jacket while she spoke with remarkable steadiness, encouraging him to stay awake until help arrived. She had never asked who he was. She had never looked impressed by the expensive watch on his wrist or the luxury vehicle resting damaged nearby. To her, he had simply been another human being needing help. Hours later, after doctors assured him he would recover completely, he searched every waiting room in the county hospital hoping to thank her. A nurse handed him a folded hospital blanket and explained that the young woman had quietly left after confirming he was safe. She had refused to leave her name, refused every offer of compensation, and declined the reward that local authorities later attempted to deliver. The only clue she left behind was the bracelet Ethan had insisted she accept before she disappeared. He had told her it was a reminder that kindness deserved to be remembered. She had smiled gently before answering with words that continued to echo through every major milestone of his career. "Do not remember me. Remember what you owe the world." Sitting inside the warmth of countless boardrooms over the following decade, Ethan had repeated those words to himself whenever success threatened to harden his heart. Yet somewhere along the way, quarterly earnings, international acquisitions, and endless responsibilities had become louder than the quiet promise he made beside that hospital bed. Watching Nia now, sharing her only meal with someone who had even less than she did, Ethan realized the greatest debt of his life had never been measured in dollars. It had been measured in the courage to become the kind of person she already was. Nia remained on the bench long after the winter sun climbed above the rooftops, sipping her coffee slowly as though every warm swallow deserved gratitude. Ethan stayed inside the parked sedan across the street, resisting every instinct that urged him to walk over and speak her name, even though he had never truly known it. Something told him that rushing into her life with questions and apologies would only satisfy his own conscience instead of honoring hers. He had built an empire by making fast decisions, but this moment demanded patience rather than power. He quietly asked his driver to remain where they were before dialing the only person he trusted with matters requiring complete discretion. Within minutes, his chief of staff, Daniel Harper, answered. Ethan spoke with unusual restraint. He did not ask for a background investigation meant to expose or judge. He simply wanted to know how a woman capable of changing another person's life had somehow disappeared into hardship. Daniel understood immediately and promised complete confidentiality. By late afternoon, Ethan returned to his office overlooking Midtown Manhattan, but the towering skyline no longer inspired him. The quarterly reports waiting on his polished walnut desk remained untouched while snow continued falling beyond the floor-to-ceiling windows. Hours later, Daniel entered carrying a simple manila folder instead of his usual digital tablet. He placed it gently on the desk before speaking. Her name is Nia Brooks. Ethan repeated the name silently, surprised by how naturally it belonged to the memory he had carried for 10 years. Daniel continued carefully, each fact revealing another piece of a life that had quietly unraveled. Nia had graduated with honors from a respected university in New York, earning a degree in social work because she believed lasting change began by helping people rebuild their dignity instead of merely surviving another day. She had worked for several nonprofit organizations, mentoring teenagers, assisting struggling families, and organizing community food drives in neighborhoods most people overlooked. Former colleagues described her with the same words again and again. Dependable, compassionate, honest, the kind of person who stayed after everyone else had gone home. Ethan listened without interrupting, recognizing the same quiet strength he had witnessed beside that lonely highway. Then Daniel's voice softened. 6 years earlier, Nia's mother had been diagnosed with a serious chronic illness requiring expensive treatment not fully covered by insurance. Nia sold nearly everything she owned to keep her mother comfortable. She accepted additional jobs during evenings and weekends, sleeping only a few hours each night while refusing financial assistance from friends who offered repeatedly. After her mother passed away, another hardship arrived almost immediately. Her younger brother Marcus suffered a spinal injury that required months of rehabilitation. Once again, Nia became his only source of support. Medical bills multiplied faster than income. Savings disappeared. Retirement accounts were emptied. Eventually, she lost her apartment after choosing hospital payments over rent. Ethan lowered his eyes toward the folder, unable to look anywhere else. "Did she ever ask anyone for help?" he asked quietly. Daniel slowly shook his head. "There is no record of it. Every interview says the same thing. She always believed accepting an opportunity was different from accepting pity." Silence settled over the office. The city lights outside began reflecting across the glass, turning Ethan's own image into a ghost standing among countless illuminated buildings. He thought about every award he had accepted praising corporate leadership, every speech celebrating resilience, every headline describing him as self-made. Yet the woman who had embodied those virtues more completely than anyone he had ever known had faded into the margins of society without complaint or recognition. Daniel hesitated before opening the final page inside the folder. "There is one more thing." He slid forward a recent photograph taken by a volunteer organization. Nia stood inside a neighborhood soup kitchen wearing an apron, serving meals with the same gentle smile Ethan remembered from 10 years earlier. According to the report, she visited whenever her health and schedule allowed, volunteering before receiving a meal herself. Ethan stared at the image for a long time before quietly closing the folder. In that single moment, he understood the painful truth that no balance sheet could ever measure. Nia Brooks had not become poor because she lacked character. She had become poor because she had spent everything she possessed protecting the people she loved. And somehow she still found enough generosity left to feed strangers before feeding herself. The following morning, Ethan returned to the neighborhood alone, leaving behind the convoy of security vehicles that usually shadowed every public appearance. He wore a simple navy wool coat instead of an expensive tailored overcoat, hoping to blend into the ordinary rhythm of the city. The soup kitchen had already opened its doors, and the scent of fresh bread drifted into the crisp December air. Through the large front window, he saw Nia arranging trays beside a group of volunteers, greeting each guest with the same gentle respect regardless of whether they arrived wearing business suits or threadbare jackets. She never rushed anyone. She looked into every pair of eyes as though each person deserved to be seen. Ethan remained outside for several minutes, gathering a kind of courage he had never needed inside a boardroom. Finally, he stepped through the entrance. The room was warm with conversation and laughter, the kind of warmth money could never purchase. Nia noticed him almost immediately. Her expression remained calm, polite, and unfamiliar. She smiled the same welcoming smile she offered everyone else. "Good morning. Would you like some coffee?" she asked. Ethan looked at her for a moment before answering softly. "I would, thank you." She poured a fresh cup and placed it gently before him. "Please have a seat. Breakfast will be ready in just a few minutes." He accepted the cup, noticing how steady her hands remained despite everything life had demanded of them. She had no sign that she recognized the man standing before her. Perhaps 10 years had changed his face as much as success had changed his life. When the morning crowd began to thin, Ethan approached her again. "May I have a few minutes of your time?" Nia studied him politely before nodding toward an empty table near the window. They sat across from each other while snowflakes drifted quietly beyond the glass. "My name is Ethan Ashford," he said. There was no visible reaction. If she recognized the name from newspapers or business magazines, she chose not to acknowledge it. "I own a company downtown." Nia smiled faintly. "Congratulations. I hope you use it to do something good." The simple response caught him off guard. Most introductions ended with admiration or curiosity. Hers ended with quiet expectation. Ethan reached into the inside pocket of his coat and carefully placed a folded photograph on the table. It showed a younger man lying beneath a hospital blanket, smiling weakly beside a young woman wearing a soaked denim jacket. Time had faded the colors, but not the memory. Nia picked up the photograph. Her eyes rested on it for several long seconds before slowly lifting toward him. "You were the man from Tennessee," she whispered. Ethan nodded. "I searched for you for 10 years. A gentle silence settled between them. Finally she smiled, not with excitement but with peaceful relief. "I always wondered if you recovered." Ethan felt emotion rise in his chest. "Everything I have today exists because you stopped that day." Nia shook her head almost immediately. "No. Everything you have exists because of the choices you made afterward." Ethan reached into his briefcase and quietly removed an envelope. Inside rested a certified check written for $5 million. He slid it across the table with both hands. "Please allow me to repay even a fraction of what I owe you." Nia looked down at the envelope without touching it. Then, with remarkable gentleness, she pushed it back toward him. "You cannot repay kindness with money," she said. Ethan blinked, certain he had misunderstood. "This could change your life." Nia's voice remained calm, carrying neither anger nor pride. "If gratitude can be purchased, then it stops being gratitude. It becomes a transaction. I did not help you because I expected a reward, and I cannot accept one now simply because your life turned out differently than mine." Ethan stared at the untouched envelope, realizing that every negotiation he had ever mastered had prepared him for contracts, acquisitions, and billion-dollar mergers, but not for this quiet woman who measured wealth by an entirely different standard. For the first time in many years, the richest man in the room understood that he had absolutely nothing to offer the person sitting across from him. After leaving the soup kitchen, Ethan carried the untouched envelope back to his office, but it felt heavier than any contract he had ever signed. $5 million had failed to accomplish what one sincere conversation had done in less than an hour. For the first time in years, someone had reminded him that dignity could not be bought, only respected. He canceled every remaining meeting on his calendar and spent the afternoon staring across the Manhattan skyline, replaying each word Nia had spoken. She had never asked him for anything. Not 10 years ago. Not now. That truth refused to leave him. The following morning he returned to the neighborhood once again, but this time he did not arrive with a check or an offer. Instead, he walked into the soup kitchen wearing a simple volunteer apron handed to him by an elderly woman who smiled without recognizing the billionaire standing before her. She pointed toward a stack of empty trays and asked if he could help carry them into the dining area. Ethan nodded without hesitation. The work was ordinary, almost invisible, yet strangely satisfying. He filled coffee cups, wiped tables, greeted guests, and listened far more than he spoke. Every few minutes his eyes drifted toward Nia. She moved through the room with quiet purpose, remembering names, asking about families, congratulating one man on finding a new apartment, encouraging another woman before an upcoming job interview. She treated every conversation as though it mattered, and somehow each person left smiling a little more than when they arrived. During a short break, she walked over carrying 2 paper cups of coffee and offered one to Ethan. "You came back," she said with a gentle smile. Ethan accepted the cup. I realized I introduced myself as a businessman before introducing myself as a person. Nia laughed softly. That happens more often than you would think. They sat near the back entrance where snow continued to fall beyond the narrow alley. For several quiet moments, neither of them spoke. Finally, Ethan asked, "Why did you refuse the money when you clearly have needs of your own?" Nia looked into her coffee before answering. "Because if I accepted it, every good thing I did that day in Tennessee would suddenly have a price attached to it. I could never allow that memory to become a receipt." Ethan absorbed her words carefully. "Then tell me how I can help." She looked at him with thoughtful eyes. "Do not help me because you feel guilty. Help because you finally understand how many people are standing exactly where I am standing." Ethan frowned slightly. "You are asking me to help strangers instead of helping you." Nia nodded. "I have survived difficult seasons before. Many people here have no one at all. If you truly want to honor what happened 10 years ago, create more second chances. Not only for me, for all of them." Her answer unsettled him in the best possible way. Throughout his career, every problem had been solved by identifying one objective and directing resources toward it. Nia was asking something entirely different. She was asking him to stop seeing individuals as isolated stories and begin seeing communities that had quietly fallen through the cracks. Before they returned inside, Ethan noticed a framed photograph hanging near the kitchen doorway. It showed volunteers serving meals during the previous Thanksgiving. Nia stood in the center, smiling beside dozens of families. There was no spotlight on her, no award, no recognition, only genuine joy in watching others eat together. Ethan understood then that she had never measured success by what she owned. She measured it by how many people walked away with renewed hope. As he folded his apron at the end of the day, a realization settled deep within him. Repaying one extraordinary woman would always be too small a dream. Becoming the kind of man who could multiply her kindness thousands of times over was the only answer worthy of the gift she had given him. Over the next several weeks, Ethan found himself returning to the neighborhood so often that it quietly became part of his routine. His executive assistants noticed that every Thursday morning disappeared from his calendar without explanation. Investors assumed he was negotiating another acquisition. Board members believed he was meeting government officials. None of them imagined that the billionaire they admired spent those hours arranging chairs, carrying boxes of canned food, and listening to stories inside a modest community kitchen tucked between aging apartment buildings. The work gradually changed him in ways quarterly profits never could. He began recognizing familiar faces, remembering birthdays, asking about job interviews, and celebrating small victories that would never appear in a financial report. Through those conversations, he discovered that most people were not looking for someone to rescue them. They were simply hoping someone would believe they still had value. Nia never treated anyone as a problem waiting to be solved. She treated every person as someone whose story was still being written. Ethan admired that more with each passing day. One snowy afternoon, they walked together after the lunch service, carrying empty donation boxes toward a nearby storage building. The streets were unusually quiet, blanketed beneath fresh snow that softened every sound around them. Ethan finally asked a question that had lingered in his heart for years. "Have you ever regretted stopping that day on the highway?" Nia looked surprised before smiling gently. "Not for a single moment. Even knowing where life eventually brought you?" he asked. She nodded without hesitation. "Kindness cannot depend on what happens afterward. If I only help people when I know life will reward me, then I am not really helping. I am making an investment." Ethan lowered his eyes, humbled once again by the simplicity of her wisdom. As they reached the storage room, Nia carefully organized the shelves before noticing a small notebook resting on a nearby table. It contained handwritten names of families expected to need extra groceries before Christmas. She quietly added 3 more names to the list. Ethan glanced toward the page. "You still know everyone?" She laughed softly. "Most of them. People deserve to be remembered." Her answer stayed with him long after they finished working. That evening he instructed Daniel to prepare a complete report, not on market opportunities, but on housing insecurity, workforce reentry programs, community kitchens, and nonprofit organizations across New York City. He spent hours reading through statistics that once would have been delegated to someone else. Behind every number he now imagined a face, a conversation, a family, or a dream interrupted by circumstances that could happen to almost anyone. Several days later, Ethan returned to the soup kitchen carrying nothing except a small paper bag from a neighborhood bakery. He handed it to Nia with an almost uncertain smile. "They had your favorite cinnamon rolls this morning." She looked at him with amused curiosity. "How would you know my favorite?" Ethan smiled for the first time in what felt like years. "Mrs. Alvarez told me. She said you always save one for Marcus whenever you visit him." Nia laughed warmly, the sound bright enough to lift the winter air around them. "She really does tell everyone everything." For a brief moment, neither of them thought about wealth or hardship. They were simply two people sharing fresh pastries and quiet conversation, while volunteers decorated the dining room with handmade paper snowflakes for the upcoming holiday meal. Ethan realized that the distance separating their worlds had become smaller with every ordinary moment they shared. Yet just as hope began settling comfortably into his heart, he noticed something different in Nia's eyes. There was gratitude, there was peace, but there was also the quiet expression of someone preparing to say goodbye. She folded the empty bakery bag carefully, slipped it into her coat pocket, and looked toward the falling snow with a thoughtful smile before speaking words Ethan never expected to hear. "There is something I need to do before Christmas, and I do not know when I will be back." 3 days passed, then 5, and by the end of the following week Nia had not returned. The familiar corner where volunteers usually greeted her remained strangely quiet. Her favorite apron still hung neatly on the hook beside the kitchen door, untouched, as though it were patiently waiting for its owner to walk back in at any moment. Ethan arrived every Thursday just as he always had, carrying fresh bread from the neighborhood bakery, but each visit ended with the same unanswered silence. He tried not to worry. After all, she had warned him that she needed to leave before Christmas. Still, something inside him refused to settle. Finally, he approached Mrs. Alvarez, the elderly volunteer who seemed to know everyone. She smiled kindly before her expression softened with concern. She said she had to visit her brother. She promised she would come back, but she did not leave an address. Ethan nodded politely, thanking her. Yet the answer only deepened the emptiness he felt. Later that afternoon, he asked Daniel to make a few discreet phone calls, reminding him once again that Nia's privacy mattered more than speed. 2 days later, Daniel arrived with another thin folder. "We found Marcus Brooks," he explained quietly. "He completed his rehabilitation several months ago. He recently accepted a maintenance position at a small community center in Vermont." Ethan looked up immediately. "And Nia?" Daniel shook his head. "There is no employment record, no permanent address, and no financial activity after she left New York. The only thing we know is that she traveled north by bus." Ethan thanked him and closed the folder. For several minutes, he remained motionless before making a decision that surprised even himself. He canceled an international investor summit that had been scheduled for months. His executive team protested. News outlets speculated about market strategy. Shareholders demanded explanations. Ethan offered none. Early the next morning, he climbed into a simple sport utility vehicle with Daniel and began driving north through the Hudson Valley. The city skyline gradually disappeared behind snow-covered hills, replaced by quiet roads winding through forests and small towns decorated with modest Christmas wreaths. The farther they traveled, the lighter Ethan felt, as though every mile carried him farther away from the version of himself who believed every important answer could be found inside a conference room. They stopped in one town after another, speaking with pastors, community organizers, and volunteer coordinators. Most had never heard Nia's name, yet every conversation reminded Ethan how many ordinary people quietly dedicated their lives to serving others without recognition. Late on the second afternoon, they reached a small Vermont town where fresh snow rested gently across white church steeples and wooden storefronts. Inside the local community center, children laughed while decorating paper ornaments. Seniors gathered around long tables sharing homemade soup. Volunteers moved calmly between rooms, carrying blankets, books, and donated winter coats. Ethan noticed something familiar before he saw her face. A faded woven leather bracelet rested on a pair of steady hands arranging fresh fruit into small baskets for local families. Nia stood near the back of the room, smiling as she patiently taught a little girl how to tie a ribbon around a holiday gift. She looked healthier than when he had first seen her in Manhattan, though her clothes remained simple and well-worn. She had not come north to escape the world. She had come here for exactly the same reason she had always gone anywhere. Someone needed help. Ethan remained quietly near the entrance, unwilling to interrupt the peaceful scene before him. As if sensing his presence, Nia slowly turned around. Their eyes met across the room, and a gentle smile spread across her face, carrying neither surprise nor embarrassment. It was the smile of someone who believed that people who were meant to keep growing together would eventually find the same road again, no matter how far apart life had briefly led them. The little girl finished tying the ribbon around the gift box and ran toward her grandmother with a smile bright enough to warm the entire room. Nia watched her go before walking calmly across the polished wooden floor toward Ethan. Neither of them spoke immediately. Outside, soft snow continued falling over the quiet Vermont town, covering the streets in peaceful silence. Inside, volunteers arranged tables for the evening meal while families laughed together around handmade decorations. It was the kind of place where nobody cared about titles or bank accounts. They cared only that everyone had a seat at the table. Ethan smiled first. "I suppose I should stop being surprised that I always find you helping someone." Nia laughed gently. "And I suppose I should stop being surprised that you keep finding me." For a moment they simply stood there, grateful that no explanation was necessary. Ethan looked around the community center with quiet admiration. "You built something beautiful here." Nia shook her head. "I only joined people who were already doing beautiful work." She introduced him to volunteers, to Marcus, whose steady walk and cheerful spirit filled Ethan with relief, and to children who proudly showed handmade holiday cards waiting to be delivered to elderly neighbors spending Christmas alone. As the afternoon passed, Ethan found himself carrying donation boxes, assembling care packages, and decorating tables alongside everyone else. Nobody recognized him as one of the wealthiest businessmen in America. To them, he was simply another volunteer willing to help. Strangely, that anonymity felt like freedom. Later that evening, after the last family had gone home, Ethan and Nia stepped outside onto the front porch. The cold air carried the scent of pine trees, and tiny lights hanging from nearby storefronts reflected across the fresh snow. Ethan reached into his coat pocket, not for another check, but for the worn leather bracelet receipt he had kept folded inside his wallet for 10 years. He unfolded the faded paper carefully before smiling. "I carried this because I thought one day I would finally be able to prove that I never forgot you." Nia looked at the receipt before gently folding it closed again. "You never needed proof." Ethan looked toward the quiet street. "I spent years believing I owed you money. Then I believed I owed you gratitude. Now I think I owe you something much bigger." She waited patiently. "You reminded me that success means very little if it only changes one life." Nia smiled softly. "Then change more than one." Ethan nodded. "I am going to." He told her about the research he had completed over the past several weeks, about the conversations with nonprofit leaders, housing advocates, and local communities throughout New York. He explained that, for the first time, every business decision he planned to make would begin with one question instead of one projection. Who benefits if this succeeds? Nia listened quietly, never interrupting. When he finished, she looked at him with the same calm expression she had worn beside that highway 10 years earlier. "That is the man I hoped would climb out of that hospital bed." Ethan felt emotion rise behind his eyes. "I almost became someone else." She gently shook her head. "No, you only became busy. There is a difference." Those words settled deeply within him. The snow continued falling as church bells echoed faintly across the town square. Ethan realized that every important lesson of his life had arrived through ordinary conversations with an extraordinary woman who never asked for recognition. Before returning inside, he looked once more at the families leaving the community center carrying groceries, warm blankets, and handmade gifts. For the first time in many years, He could see the future with complete clarity. It would not be built around expanding his fortune. It would be built around expanding hope, one community at a time, beginning with the promise he silently made beneath that peaceful winter sky. Several months later, the first Hope Center opened its doors in a renovated brick building on the edge of Manhattan, only a few blocks from the very street where Ethan had first seen Nia standing quietly in line for a simple meal. The building offered temporary housing, job training, financial counseling, health resources, and warm meals. But above the entrance, another message welcomed every visitor before they stepped inside. It read, "Every second chance begins with dignity." Ethan insisted those words become the foundation of every future center, because he had finally learned that lasting change always started by seeing people before seeing their circumstances. News organizations from across the country gathered for the opening ceremony, expecting another carefully polished corporate announcement. Instead, they watched one of America's most successful businessmen stand behind a simple wooden podium without boasting about donations, tax benefits, or business strategy. He spoke about gratitude, responsibility, and the quiet courage of ordinary people who changed lives without ever asking for recognition. He never mentioned the amount of money invested in the project. He never described himself as generous. Instead, he thanked volunteers, teachers, nurses, social workers, churches, neighborhood organizations, and every person who believed that compassion remained one of the strongest investments a community could ever make. When reporters asked who had inspired the entire initiative, Ethan smiled and stepped away from the microphone. From the front row, Nia quietly walked onto the stage, wearing the same calm expression that had never changed despite everything life had placed before her. The audience rose to its feet before she even spoke. She looked across the crowd for a long moment before saying softly, "People often believe they need extraordinary power to change someone's future. The truth is much simpler. Sometimes all it takes is stopping when everyone else keeps walking." Silence filled the room before warm applause echoed through the building. Nia accepted no award and requested no title beyond community director, insisting that every center remain connected to the neighborhoods it served instead of becoming another distant institution. Ethan agreed without hesitation. Over the following year, Hope Centers quietly opened in cities across the country, each one built through partnerships with local organizations already serving their communities with wisdom and compassion. Thousands of people found temporary housing, job opportunities, educational support, and renewed confidence, but the greatest transformation could not be measured in annual reports. It appeared in conversations shared around dinner tables, children watching their parents return to work with renewed pride, and neighbors discovering that hope often grows strongest when people choose to stand beside one another instead of apart. On a snowy December evening, exactly 1 year after their unexpected reunion, Ethan and Nia returned to the same Manhattan soup kitchen where everything had begun again. Nothing about the room had changed except the number of volunteers. Together they stood behind the serving counter, placing warm meals into waiting hands while greeting every guest by name whenever possible. Near the end of the evening, a little girl accepted her dinner before quietly breaking her bread in half and offering one piece to an older man sitting alone nearby. Ethan noticed the gesture immediately. Nia smiled without saying a word. Neither of them had taught the child to do that. Kindness had simply found another heart willing to carry it forward. As the final chairs were folded and the lights grew softer, Ethan looked at the faded leather bracelet still resting on Nia's wrist. It no longer reminded him of a debt he needed to repay. It reminded him that the greatest wealth any person could ever possess was the ability to leave someone else's life brighter than they found it. And beneath the peaceful glow of the winter evening, surrounded by ordinary people sharing an ordinary meal, both of them understood that the smallest act of compassion, offered without expecting anything in return, could travel farther than anyone would ever live to see.